Hello, welcome. Thank you for joining us for Adobe on AI, building trust with customers in the age of AI. I'm your host, Lindsay Morris from Adobe, and I am so thrilled to be joined by these industry leaders and AI experts, Emily McReynolds, Emmy Huang, Andy Parsons, and Ray Lanzigan. So here is how today's show is going to go. First, we'll hear from Emily and Emmy on trusted AI in practice, including the way Adobe is fostering responsible AI use internally and with our customers. Then we'll learn from Andy about Adobe's content authenticity for enterprise, which allows enterprises to verify the provenance of content at any stage of its journey. Next, we'll have a discussion with our special guest, Ray from Publicis Groupe, on how they are embedding trust in the content supply chain. And then we'll have time for audience Q&A, so please submit questions as we go. We also have experts responding to your questions in the background, so don't be shy. And when something piques your interest, let us know on the survey to the right side of your screen, and we'll be sure to follow up with you. And yes, this session is being recorded and it'll be sent to you after we wrap. Okay, let's get into it. I am so excited to welcome Emily McReynolds. Emily leads global AI strategy for the Digital Strategy Group at Adobe. Her experience spans data governance, machine learning, and AI across technical research and industry, including at Microsoft and Meta. She deeply understands the challenges and opportunities organizations encounter when rolling out AI. Hi, Emily. It's so good to see you.
Hi, Lindsay. Great to be here again.
We are really excited to be talking about this topic today, and we would love to get a pulse from the audience to get us centered. So, for the audience, let us know, how is your organization building trust in agentic AI?
This is such an important question right now. I think, there's a lot of conversation about where we're at in terms of AI and how companies are using it. And so thinking about how your company is dedicating time, energy, and resources to transparency and explainability so people know when they're seeing AI and how something maybe was made with it. Uh, Being able to reassure people that you have humans in the loop involved in key decision points around data, particularly personal information. We're also talking a lot about how we strengthen security and think about governance. We've had years of data governance, and now what does that mean with AI? And of course, this is an always on, always learning system. So we have to think about how we're doing monitoring, how we're doing feedback. An example from Adobe with Firefly, if there's something that comes out of the system that isn't what you're looking for, there's a feedback mechanism to let us know what we might need to improve on.
Right. Okay. Thanks for letting us know. We are going to be touching on all of these ways of building trust in agentic AI throughout today's session. Emily, we're excited to learn from you today. I'll hand it over to you.
Thanks, Lindsay. I think it's really helpful to understand how we got here. Oftentimes machine learning, artificial intelligence, it can seem like this big new thing that is hard to understand. And fundamentally, we're starting with data and understanding what the right pieces are to train a form of system that can potentially help you work faster. So we think about a level one assisted perspective. That's us using Claude or ChatGPT in our work and finding ways to be more efficient, to get help, to do research. And we can see this growth in business impact as we get into the higher stages, of course, of automation, but also in terms of understanding and trust. So when we get to a level two with something augmenting our workflows, and then really thinking about how we can bring up insights, how it can surface things for humans to make decisions about. So being able to execute a workflow autonomously is actually about a company figuring out where they're comfortable handing off decision making, where they can trust these systems, and where their customers trust them when it comes to these systems. We'll hear more about content authenticity and how you can label some of these generated images, but really being transparent so that you can understand and reassure the people who are experiencing your brand and your systems. And we really haven't reached that level 4 yet, but it's an aspiration in terms of potential new value creation. We're really seeing a big transformation right now, and that transformation can only be successful with humans making the right decisions in the right places. And so, along those lines, when we're thinking about what are the key things we can do to build trust into AI use, into agentic AI use, really being able to understand these systems and having an explainability at the level at which the audience you're talking to understands it. So, this might be as simple as, you're using AI search and it says, remember that sometimes AI can make mistakes, so check the outputs. Making sure that there's a configurable, composable choice. So we aren't in a place where we're handing everything off, which I think is part of the fear sometimes, but being able to figure out where the right place is for the human in the loop, what decisions we can make in advance, and what things we still need to review before they go out. And that changes industry to industry and company to company. I've seen very advanced comfort with agents in financial services, which might surprise people, and then some hesitation in strong retail brands that want to make sure that they control what their customers are seeing in terms of what's out there. Of course, we're always going to be talking about security, privacy, and governance. I already mentioned those, but those enterprise level controls, I hear a lot of, we can now vibe code it and we can build it ourselves. And that's really exciting when you're building something new, when you're thinking about your tech stack. But that security, privacy, and governance, when you have experience in running, maintaining, and operating these systems and workflows, it can be really critical to have a trusted platform for that space and for people to understand what you're using alongside their data. And then we've had 10 years now of building frameworks and tools and best practices for how we build AI and how we use it so that we know what to look for in terms of good labels and annotating data, being able to receive feedback from how people are experiencing these systems, and making sure we're testing for accuracy, and not just in the machine learning engineering expert way, but how we can understand it when we're using one of those systems to write papers or to create marketing content or to launch campaigns. So along those lines, it's really great that we have this opportunity to talk with Emmy. And Lindsay, I think you're going to kick us off into that.
Yeah, thank you so much for centering us around these building blocks for trust with agentic AI. As Emily said, next up, we had a chance to sit down with Adobe's Emmy Huang to learn about how we're advancing employee trust and productivity through AI at Adobe. Emmy is the Vice President of Strategy and Operations for Adobe's corporate strategy, development, and incubator organization. She currently co leads the AI at Adobe initiative, focusing on enhancing employee productivity through AI and oversees the enterprise OKR program. Due to scheduling, Emmy couldn't be here live today, but let's hear what she had to say.
Thanks so much for joining me for this conversation today, Emmy. I'm really excited to talk about trusting customers. Can you tell us a bit about your role and the creation of the AI at Adobe committee?
Thank you, and thanks for having me on today. Sure. Back in 2023, just as Adobe was getting ready to ship our first version of the Firefly model, our executive team wanted to ensure that we were also thinking about how generative AI should be adopted internally for our own productivity and how that might change the way that we work in the future. And we were seeing a lot of energy and desire for experimentation across the company. And at the same time, of course, a lot of questions. So, a big part of my role over the last few years has been helping Adobe figure out just how our employees adopt AI responsibly in practice. So, not just what we believe in, but how those beliefs actually show up in our day to day work. And so the committee was created to answer those questions in a practical way. I co lead it with Tony Van Winkle, who runs our digital employee experience organization in IT, and she's responsible for many of the productivity tools that we use and deploy to our employees today. And at the start, this goal was never to slow teams down. In fact, it was really designed to provide stewardship and clarity so people could actually experiment responsibly and faster and share all that learning in the open. So, what we do is help create the conditions for Adobe employees to use AI safely, responsibly, and at scale. And not by centralizing control and reviews and approvals, but by putting in the right guardrails in place and then letting teams move as quickly or as conservatively as they want. Really, it's about responsibility. So, in a lot of ways, my role has been about connecting the dots between these principles and that practice. And we want to make sure responsible AI actually shows up in how we get our work done.
It's so important, the pieces about how and in practice. So in terms of building trust on how a company adopts cutting edge AI, would you talk about how the AI at Adobe committee aligns with Adobe's AI ethics principles?
Yeah, absolutely. So, one of the things that I've always appreciated about Adobe throughout my career here is that we always start with our principles and values. Now, Adobe first developed our AI ethics principles back in 2019 as part of our work with AI and ML, which was then called Adobe Sensei. And these principles were also first published externally for our customers in 2021. So, our approach to responsible AI in development and in how we use it is truly grounded in those three principles that you're going to hear us come back to often. It's accountability, responsibility, and transparency. And these principles are showing up in how we design the governance, assess risk, and design what's appropriate for production use as we're moving into this age of AI. So, a great example is on our committee leadership. I've brought together leaders from across legal, privacy, security, ethics, our communications partners, as well as representatives from the business. And so these senior leaders are decision makers in those key risk areas, and they own those areas, which means we have both the agency and the authority to define these rules of the road for our AI use. So, another great example is how we've integrated these responsible AI principles into how we assess our vendors. So, for example, when we bring in third party AI technologies, our assessments include those key elements that are required to establish trust between Adobe and our vendors, such as understanding the training data, how technology is tested, and really importantly, as the models evolve and the roadmaps are changing, we always go back to those questions. And do those technologies still adhere to our principles as we continue to evaluate and integrate into our own tools and technologies? So, this work and these principles are really designed to help us confidently extend this trust relationship also through to our customers.
I love the cross-functional nature of what you described because this is truly a team effort. It's not one part of the company that does this. You know, recently Adobe had a company-wide AI day, and you shared a perspective on the AI journey of a company's adoption of AI that I see as a really great form of transparency for customers to understand how brands and companies they interact with are adopting AI. Can you talk about the decision to have that day and to bring everybody together?
Yeah, I mean, what you're saying is so true. So that's one of the key reasons we even held an AI day internally, because we realized something that is, as you said, pretty important. If AI adoption feels confusing or opaque to the folks inside the company that are building these products, it is almost impossible to explain it clearly to our customers. So the perspective that I shared internally was intentionally simple. We talked about AI adoption as a journey. It's not this ladder that people are trying to climb. There's no sort of like end highest state for somebody. Thinking about it as a map to help both individuals and teams understand where are you and what does that next step look like for you. So we describe stages like first you become aware of the AI's capabilities and also its limits. How are you using it for your individual tasks? Then extending to redesigning workflows, both for yourself and then within your team. And then, of course, you start to cross between workflows that go from organization to organization. And eventually, it will become embedded into how teams operate. It will just be the new way that we work. And what this is really doing is trying to set a common language. So internally, it helps teams be honest about their starting point. And externally, it's helping customers understand what companies like Adobe are doing. We're not just like flipping on a switch and suddenly we're done with our AI integration and our AI use. We're deliberately evolving how it gets done. And of course, with the pace of change, right? Like that's a cycle. It's always going back to what are we learning? What are we codifying? And then how do we then loop back as something new comes into the environment in the system? So at AI Day, I was really emphasizing that here we are demonstrating currently how our individuals and teams are already changing how work happens. We had people come up on stage and show real life examples of how they've integrated AI into their day to day, both in pilots and experiments, as well as what's in production and used more broadly across the company. And that matters for trust. It's showing our employees that AI isn't something that's happening behind the scenes without any oversight, but we're introducing it thoughtfully, both hands on and across the company, with humans still accountable for their decisions. And so for our customers, that transparency gets extended. It's also important. It helps them see that we're not just using AI and how we're using it, but how it's being adopted and that pace of adoption, even internal to the company. So we are doing it intentionally, it's progressive, and with responsibility built in from the start.
You use this analogy of a map, which I think is super helpful as people think about not just their internal adoption, but how they message that out to their customers. When companies are thinking about that customer facing use of AI, how can their internal adoption map and translate to positive external messaging?
Yeah, I love this question because at Adobe, this internal adoption and external messaging are very tightly linked because we have a little bit of a unique position being also customers of our own products, right? So we use tools like Acrobat AI Assistant, Adobe Express, Firefly, and Gen Studio in real workflows and also with real enterprise constraints. So that matters because it means we're experiencing the same questions that our customers do around trust, accuracy, data use, and where does human judgment still need to sit as we're starting to integrate it into these different workflows. And that's where the idea of stewardship of Gen AI use really comes in. Internally, that's why we have these clear guidelines around how AI can be used, when experimentation is appropriate, and where additional review or accountability is required. And so these guidelines aren't theoretical. They're really shaping how teams actually use AI day to day, and they're constantly evolving because there's certain things that we learn that become less risky as we learn more. And there's also new areas that are coming up that introduce additional risk. And so we're constantly tweaking and tuning and then republishing those guidelines for our employees. But because we're living that experience ourselves, our external messaging doesn't have to be aspirational. So when customers come and ask us, how is AI being used, we can speak from practice. So we can explain not just what the technology can do and what the use cases are for Adobe internally, but how we are rolling it out and how we're introducing it responsibly for our employees. So again, with transparency, with these guardrails, and also making sure that our employees understand when they need to be involved and accountable for those outcomes. And that's also why at AI Day, again, we were showing real work being done instead of just a vision deck or aspirations of what we wanted employees to do. We're really trying to enforce that this AI adoption doesn't have to be a black box. It's something that we're actively stewarding. We want employees to do in the open. And both as a company building these AI powered products for our customers, but also internally as we use it every day. And that alignment is what's making this external messaging credible because it's really grounded in our lived experience and not claims. And that's what we want to go and share back out with our customers as we're talking to them about adopting our tools and technologies.
It's such a great connection. The alignment perspective of matching what you're doing internally is what makes that external messaging credible. Thinking about how you share what pieces of AI you're using and how it shows up. We're always talking about personalization and giving people these experiences that they're expecting. We also want to know how the AI is being used in it. So, what steps would you recommend to companies adopting AI right now?
Yeah, I think I'd ask people to focus on just three things. So, first, create clear internal guidelines that are grounded in the values of your company. So people know where they can experiment, when they need review, and how accountability is being maintained. And over time, a company's internal practices are the thing that really shape the credibility of this external story. Second, keep humans clearly accountable for the outcomes. And also remember that how you use AI internally will eventually show up externally in the trust that your customers play and place in your brand. And of course, finally, encourage people to talk about when they're using AI or labeling their use. I think all people want to understand when AI is being used so that they understand what they're seeing, where it came from, and of course, why it deserves their trust.
I love that, why it deserves their trust, and figuring out what the labeling looks like so we can understand it. This has been a really great conversation. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you, Emily. Always a pleasure.
Thank you to Emmy and Emily for sharing how Adobe is ensuring trust with AI internally and when innovating for our customers. I loved the note that Emmy ended on about encouraging folks to get comfortable talking about and labeling their use of AI. It's a great transition into our next segment. So, as we think about how AI accelerates the pace of storytelling with more content being created than ever, we need these new foundational built in ways to earn customer trust, like with Adobe's content authenticity for enterprise. So, this brings together the power of content credentials with the products and platforms that drive creative production and marketing at scale. Let's take a look. That joyful beat really illustrates my excitement in welcoming Adobe's Andy Parsons. Hi, Andy. It's great to see you.
Hi, Lindsay. Great to be here with you.
Andy is Adobe's global head of content authenticity, leading the company's efforts to build open technologies that verify and authenticate digital content at scale. He oversees the Content Authenticity Initiative, CAI, a global coalition of more than 6,000 organizations, including New York Times, NVIDIA, Nikon, Leica, Universal Music Group, advancing content credentials as a trusted standard for content transparency and provenance across the digital ecosystem. Andy, we are so excited to have you here and to learn from you. I will hand it over to you.
Thanks, Lindsay. And thanks, everybody, for being here. The handoff from Emmy was just about perfect. It's almost like we planned it that way. Emmy is also very involved in the Content Authenticity Initiative. I'm going to spend just a few minutes before getting into a conversation with Ray Lansigan, a colleague of mine from the Standard organization behind all of this great transparency effort, and explain a little bit about what Content Credentials is. That video was flashy and the music was super happy, but there's a lot in it. And I want to explain a little bit about specifically what this standard is all about and how it applies to enterprise in particular. And I'll start with a quick history of the organization. So there are two organizations involved in this effort. One, as Lindsay mentioned, is the Content Authenticity Initiative, which I lead at Adobe. And that's those 6,000 plus organizations who are all aligned in a broad community that does events, in-person gatherings, open source code, which I'll talk more about in a moment, all in the interest of providing transparency to consumers. And that's not only about AI transparency, that's also about simple ideas that we have needed on the internet for a long time, like if something purports to come from the BBC or your favorite news source, how do you know that it actually came from the BBC or your favorite news source when it's on social media? So simple ideas like cryptographically verifying where something came from, in some cases who made it, is kind of the basis of the idea behind content credentials. So content credentials is a standard put forth by an international nonprofit that we helped start along with the other steering committee members. It's run inside the Linux Foundation, for those familiar with nonprofit standards that on their way to ISO or IETF or other broad standards ratification groups. And it's a nonprofit that we helped start way back in 2020. So the Content Authenticity Initiative was announced in 2019. It was very quickly evident that Microsoft, the BBC, many others were working on similar ideas. And we gathered those folks together and said, let's not have multiple standards for content authenticity. Again, for consumers and businesses to understand what something is fundamentally, let's have one standard. So we got together, we formed this nonprofit. The C2PA stands for the Coalition for Content Provenance and Authenticity. You can see the steering committee members listed on that slide there. And my role and our role is we represent Adobe on the steering committee of this group. That's where decisions about what efforts to pursue, how to extend the kind of reach and breadth of the technical spec. We also have a gentleman from Adobe who chairs the technical working group, and myself and other colleagues work alongside all of these steering committee members, hundreds of other companies, on pushing forward the standard. So think of the CAI as kind of where the rubber hits the road, with open source code, broad discussions about industry applicability of content credentials, and then the C2PA as the underlying standard. So we spend hours per week in C2PA meetings pushing the standard forward, writing the standard, publishing it, testing it, et cetera. So how does this pertain to business? There are so many use cases. The consumer ones are perhaps the most obvious, like a nutrition label. Just like you can go into most grocery stores around the world, and if you choose to buy a sugary food for yourself or your family, you have a right to do that. And you also have a right to understand what's in that food and how good or bad it might be. You just look at the nutrition label. So you can think of fundamentally a content credential as sort of a genealogical list of ingredients and process. So a creator need not expose all of their secret sauce, so to speak. They can expose that this was created with AI, with Adobe Firefly, with OpenAI. Notably, Google at Google I/O just yesterday made some impactful announcements about the ability to view content credentials showing up in Gemini and in the Chrome browser. And we're very excited about that. Google, of course, is also a fellow steering committee member in the standards organization. There are also lots of business uses. I'm going to highlight one kind of straightforward common one, but there are many others. And Ray and I will get into some of them in our conversation. So outside of sort of public disclosure of AI, let's say we have a marketer in one of our companies who wants to ask a very simple question, which is, can I use this asset for a new campaign? And can I use this asset for a new campaign brings in a number of questions, including, have I used only sanctioned AI tools? Is the imagery I have licensed properly? Have the right people been compensated, licensed, et cetera? That's a very difficult question to answer. A colleague of mine on our team put this together in consultation with perhaps many of your companies, lots of Adobe customers, who explain that, you know, typically there's quite a maze to follow to get a crisp, credible answer from all the parties involved about what something is and whether it can be used for a particular purpose. Again, not only licensing, but also AI use, compensation for the creators and agencies, et cetera. And these are just a handful of the kinds of things that someone would have to know before going ahead and using an asset in that campaign. So imagine that instead of having to go consult all those people, all those databases, your DAM, your MAM, that you could have sort of a little traveling database that stays attached to the content. And that's really what a content credential is. In one regard, it's that ability to provide transparency to consumers, but there's no reason that very same piece of content provenance that's attached to a video or an image or an audio file or even a document can't also express details about licensing that you may want to keep private, you may not want to expose publicly, but that cryptographic connection, just like you would sign a PDF or a document, cryptographic connection of the provenance data to the asset that goes wherever the asset goes through systems. It could be Adobe systems, it could be other systems, hence the criticality of interoperability. That's what content credentials brings to the enterprise in this regard and many others. You can think of the content credential as this sort of sealed bit of information connected to the content that provides information and context throughout all these phases of what we call the content supply chain. Sort of like a bill of materials for everything you produce and publish. And you can imagine how that's critically important for the ad industry, around a kind of truth in advertising, understanding what something is, who made it, where it came from, just as it's critical for photojournalists, wishing to be believed and trusted, and equally critical in content supply chains for marketing and information production across all sorts of businesses. So these are some things that we're providing in a new offering from Adobe called Content Authenticity for Enterprise, affectionately named Cafe. And it is all of these things. It's that content intelligence that travels between systems. Again, could be Adobe systems, could be non-Adobe systems, could be your disk drive, it could be your mobile phone, and lots of collaborators across the ecosystem beyond Adobe, like Publicis and OpenAI and Google and many, many others. Cameras, I'll show you in a moment an example of all those things coming together. Excuse me. That enables this interoperability. So that data that's critical to understand the context of what your content supply chain looks like as that content travels through these pipelines is always available no matter where you're looking at the content. Little self-promotional bit here for Adobe. We helped create this standard. There are many offerings in the marketplace around content credentials. A few years ago, that wasn't the case, but as we see the standard get traction and we see customers across the content production ecosystem asking their vendors, one among them Adobe, to provide content credentials in tools like Premiere and AEM assets and Photoshop, et cetera, we're seeing quite a vibrant ecosystem of interoperating applications that know about content credentials and can read each other's content credentials. So we helped start the standard with Adobe's business in mind, protecting creators, matters of copyright and attribution, in addition to that kind of truth and understanding transparently what content is and where it came from. We have all those native integrations I just mentioned. So if you're already using Photoshop or Premiere or Adobe Express, you have content credentials at your fingertips. So when you have the ability to add content credentials with your kind of stamp of approval from your enterprise, you kind of have everything you need right there on your desktop already. So Adobe is a good place to start. And again, I want to emphasize that this interoperates across a large number of vendors, but we offer it across our application suite, and it's enterprise ready, it scales, all those internet-y words that you would expect from us. So let me show you an example to make this a little more concrete. That little CR icon you saw in the sizzle video and in some other slides you saw from Emmy, that stands for content credentials. It's sort of the international accepted symbol indicating that content provenance exists here. Important to note, that doesn't mean that it's not a truth indicator or an indicator that there's AI. It just says, click on this, tap on this, and you'll get that nutrition label, right? Just like the presence of a nutrition label doesn't mean it's bad for you, good for you. It says there's more information here that you might want to understand before you share it, before you use the asset, et cetera. So this is a Leica camera, the M11P that's in market that has hardware content credentials on the camera. So here we're snapping a photo of our vacation spot. We're bringing this into Adobe Lightroom, which fully supports content credentials across the entire Lightroom ecosystem, across mobile, web, both versions of desktop Lightroom. And we're bringing images in from the camera directly into Lightroom, which will read those content credentials. And then we'll make some quick edits. So in Lightroom, typically, you might punch up the colors, you might change the angle. Here's the final version, looks a lot better than what came into Lightroom. And then when we export this or publish it, we're basically going to create a cryptographic signature that carries along the original origin from the Leica camera. If I wish to add my details as photographer, we can do that as well. And then we're going to export that and use this image. Oops, there we go. So here's our ad for the vacation in the Philippines using my photo that I just took. And you can see up in the corner now the little CR icon. In this case, we're in a browser. We're using the Adobe Content Credentials browser extension, which you can see up here, that little check mark inside the Content Credentials pin shape. And that's telling me, okay, there's an image on this page. If you want to know more about it, you can do that. If I open up the browser extension, I can see all the details about all the components. So again, I mentioned a genealogy. This is sort of a provenance lineage that says, where did this come from? What assets were composited? What is this? Was AI used? How was AI used? All of those details are available in the content credential. And again, I can hide it away if I don't want to look at it. I can show it if I'm interested. And I can click on additional information there, inspect this image on the bottom. That'll take me to a dedicated portal that Adobe provides for free at content-authenticity.adobe.com. By the way, you can also sign your images or videos as an individual using a free Creative Cloud account. This is all available now. You can use it right after this webinar. Or now, if I'm blathering on and you don't want to pay attention, go to content-authenticity@adobe.com and get started. But here you can see that lineage. There are a lot more details below the fold. And I can even show the source material that was used and enjoy that full transparency if I wish to. You'll see also, by the way, that we have the photographer's name and details about the organization that's vouching for this image right there on the right-hand side. Here's that lineage, right? We can see this came from a camera that I was edited in Lightroom, if you so choose. We can even see what went into Lightroom or Photoshop and what came out of Lightroom or Photoshop if we're concerned about manipulation that might make this feel less authentic for whatever purposes we're using it. And then ultimately that final image with the content credential attached to it. Here's how this looks on Instagram, right? So we're using that same image. Instagram doesn't yet reveal the content credentials icon, but again, our browser extension, which is also free in the Chrome store, will show you that little content credentials icon as soon as you browse the Instagram page. And again, on the right there, we can see all the details of all the images with their provenance that traveled with that image or asset. So that should give you a little kind of taste of what content credentials is, why it's broadly applicable, why we got into this for content transparency purposes for consumers, to make sure that we can innovate responsibly and provide details about what was used, why it was used, who used it, and then a few business cases. And I think there's no better business case to be illustrated than our steadfast partner, Publicis. I want to bring Ray Lansing on. Ray and I are partners in the C2PA. We both represent our companies in the steering committee. And welcome, Ray. Good to have you here.
Thank you. Hi, Andy.
So let's, we're gonna have a conversation, and please queue up your questions for Ray and I and others. But I wanted to have a conversation with Ray because Publicis's use case and reason for being involved in this broad coalition are very complementary, but different from Adobe's, right? We got into this to make sure that our tools could provide that transparency and power for creators and enterprises. You're in a very specific industry, obviously close to Adobe, across the agency world. And I'd love to start just understanding why you and Publicis got involved in this kind of content provenance and how it's been so far.
Sure. Happy to talk about that. So we joined the C2PA about 3 years ago. And the premise was really that we wanted to safeguard the economy in the digital ecosystem. And so when I think about where we sit and the advertisers that we represent, there's trillions of dollars that are at play, the $1 trillion in advertising itself, but also, the tens of trillions of dollars that are represented in the value of brand equity, in the value of the brands. And so as Gen AI was starting to proliferate, a question that was often raised to us was, how do we preserve the authenticity of our brands? And that's kind of what led us to the C2PA. And like any marketplace, I think about this through the supply side and the demand side. So on the supply side, we have brands that want to make sure that their trademarked assets have a form of protection. We have creators with the creator economy that are a huge part of our marketing mix, and wanted to give those creators who are integral to our content supply chain the tools to ensure that their work had a way of demonstrating its authenticity. And then on the demand side, we wanted to make sure that the advertising that we were putting out into the world on behalf of our clients, that users and consumers had a way to determine if that content was in fact coming from the brand or if it was being spoofed by another actor. So for all of those reasons, it was sort of this existential moment where, of course, it was important to us because it was important to our people and our clients, but it was one where we saw that it was really important to the industry as well.
That's great. And one of the telltale signs that I've enjoyed kind of watching emerge as we see adoption, and you've observed this as well, is to see the trade associations coming on board, right? Making recommendations. I think there's probably not a trade association in existence that hasn't written some kind of guidance about AI usage. And that's net good, but in the agency ad world in particular, it's very important that they also kind of unify probably around a standard or some way to have interoperable signals. We often think of these as trust signals. I didn't mention that in my preamble, but in addition to thinking of this as a nutrition label, a content credential is really a set of trust signals. And you mentioned trust in your first remarks, Ray. So what are the trade associations thinking about? I can imagine this is sort of an existential moment for the industry broadly, because you want to provide those trust signals to consumers. But what are the trade associations doing, and what do you think are the most important trust signals for your industry?
Sure. So the trade associations are very much focused on standardizing the taxonomy of how the different parts of the advertising ecosystem are going to insert data fields. So things like, who was the creator? Who's the ultimate owner of the asset? What was the, what was the chain of editing? What tools were being used in editing? So that part is a linchpin for adoption, because as we talk to the brand advertisers, the agencies that they work with, or even the platform partners, the DSPs that are trafficking out the assets, that standard nomenclature and taxonomy is really important. It also becomes important for the user to, be able to see a common set of attributes. So if they're looking at something from McDonald's or Bank of America or Nike, for example, there's an awareness of what fields to inspect to determine the veracity of that asset. So, working with a variety of trade associations, the ANA, which typically represents the brand side, the 4As, which typically represents the advertising agency side, and then the IAB, which does a little bit of both. It's been nice to see them converge on a common problem, which is to take the content credential spec as it is and build some what I describe as scaffolding that connects the core spec to the marketing and advertising industry. And together, with those trade associations who really are able to evangelize this cause across all, on behalf of the industry, it's been great to see the momentum and the collaboration across those trade organizations as well. With regard to your question on what is most important to include, I think probably the single biggest the single most important field is who created the asset that was being used, right? And so I want to know, when I'm wearing my consumer hat, that the brand is ultimately behind the creation, the publishing, the trafficking of that asset. And I want to know that they have the custody and the they want to have that they have the custody of that asset throughout that chain, right? And if something happens, I want to be able to see where and how that content has been edited. So I think that's the most important piece of data, and then of course sub elements of that become important as well.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think of provenance, and I think you do as well, as kind of two flavors or two complementary sides of the same coin. One is the what of provenance, like simply knowing that something is a photograph or started life as a photograph and is lightly edited without AI, which are things that C2PA content credentials could tell you, is one kind of trust signal for outside of your industry. If you don't know me and I send you an image and I say this is real, it depicts something that happened. If you don't know me, there's no trust between us, right? I could be an organization or an individual. But if I can prove to you this is a photograph from that Leica camera, because it's interoperable, just like Wi-Fi and Bluetooth, then I basically sent you a meaningful trust signal. Like, okay, at least I know this was captured on a camera and it's not a picture of a computer screen. It has the right depth map, et cetera. The other kind of provenance, and maybe the most important trust signal in media, I would say, outside of news, is who made it, right? Who's claiming responsibility for it? So maybe not the individual designer, although in many cases that's helpful to individuals' careers and folks we work with at Adobe, but the Coca-Colas or the brands of the world, as you mentioned. So at Adobe, we're seeing a clarion call from enterprise customers for both. Sometimes one or the other, but sometimes both. And the reason that we are getting into this kind of business of content authenticity for enterprise is not because we're forcing it on the environment that we work in, but because existing Adobe customers are asking for it, either for compliance with regulations that are coming down the pike this year and beyond, or because they have that same ideal that you at Publicis have, which is we have to provide these trust signals to our downstream consumers, be they B2B or B2C. So what's the complement in your industry at Publicis? What are your customers looking for? What do you anticipate them wanting? And yeah, I assume you're excited to provide it, but it'd be great to give the audience a look into that.
Yeah, for sure. The clients that I work with, everyone is leaned into the topic. There have been some early adopters and early hand raisers that have some patterns among them, and it's typically in industries where there's a high cost of failure. And what I mean by that is either there's a lot of money on the line because there's a financial transaction, or there's a lot of value in the authenticity. And so in that, I would put industries like luxury, beauty, so areas where industries where authenticity is of high value, and then also categories where there are early drops and product drops, where there could be a lot of speculation as to what the newest sneaker or what the newest cell phone might look like after the announcement. And in that case, the brands are very interested in being able to attribute any of the product imagery or messaging back to the brand, as opposed to, again, some actor that might be, acting outside of brand guidelines.
Yes, that makes sense. And I remember when we were all sort of, well, speaking of only for myself, my team was sort of obsessed with the metaverse. Remember those days, like not too long ago? There was the notion that maybe a customer like LVMH would want to be able to verify veracity and the authenticity of a handbag in the virtual space, right? Just like you would want to be able to authenticate it via some sort of certificate of authenticity. And that's another way to think about content credentials, right? Especially when it pertains to a brand. Like, I don't really care what this handbag is made out of. I want to know that it's a Louis Vuitton handbag, for example. And I should have mentioned earlier, one of the nice characteristics of content credentials, as you know, Ray, is that they are tamper evident. So if somebody changes, take an image, for example, if you change the pixels of an image after it has received its content credential, that digital signature no longer matches. So we can know that this was changed after it was credentialized, if you will. And similarly, if you go and change the data, like if this comes from Publicis or one of your agencies, and I say, I'm going to change it so it's from andyparsons.com, I can't do that because I have tampered with that data and it's cryptographically connected to the asset. So that's a really nice characteristic that is probably I would say, among the primary innovations of the C2PA and content credentials themselves. So I think in both our lines of work, Ray, we're assailed with new watermarks, blockchain techniques, startups, lots of approaches, which I also find actually very rewarding. It means that the moment for content credentials and things like it has arrived. There's a real desire for it, just like there's an understanding that if I say I'm Andy Parsons and I approve this message and I'm a politician, that's no good anymore, right? Because you can deep fake my voice. But providing some kind of digital security that this actually came from me and my organization is critically important. So what brought you to content credentials in particular, given the kind of soup of watermarks and fingerprints and all the various techniques that we talk about quite often?
Yeah, it's a great question. So the elements that we were looking for were that we wanted a solution that would travel well through the digital ecosystem. And so whether I'm on a social media platform or a browser or natively on a mobile device, that there was something that followed that asset, similar to how a piece of content would travel across the digital ecosystem. We wanted a solution that would be present throughout. And that's not to say that some of the solutions that live squarely on a platform are bad. And in fact, content credentials and some of those watermarks and digital fingerprints, they're highly complementary. And we really need all of them. But as I think about the work that I do on behalf of my clients and how content is going to appear in many places and spaces, the critical element that we were looking for was is the signal, the trust signal, going to be persistent? Is it going to be durable? Is it going to be tamper evident? All of the things that we've been talking about here. And content credentials is the industry-wide standard to do that. And so it's not, I don't think about it as one or the other, but I think about it as definitely both. And, content credentials as a very strong part of the provenance solution.
Yeah, I agree. And I want to give you a little extra credit and flattery here. I would say it wasn't the de facto standard until well after you and Publicis joined and helped us make it so, because as we know, good ideas, standardized or not, unless there's adoption, they really don't matter. And in this environment of being assailed by AI for good and bad, the pace of innovation and new technologies around AI, the ability to fake legitimate assets really requires a solution like content credentials. And I think we've both been very pleased to see the readiness of the standard for prime time, the need for a standard like it in prime time, the regulatory environment, all kind of come together at this nexus. And really it's this moment, which is why I'm so glad we're talking today. Again, sort of reified just yesterday in the Google I/O announcements, where we see a lot of these ideas coming together. And I'm excited to continue working with you, Ray. Thanks for joining me for this conversation. And we could talk for hours. I think we actually have in the past, but a good short snippet, and appreciate your insights.
Andy, Ray, thank you so much for sharing your leadership and your expertise with us. I think we could talk all day about this. Good news, there were quite a few questions that came through from the audience. So if you'll spend a little more time with us, we have quite a few that have come in. We'll invite Emily back on screen for the Q&A as well. And then for the audience, if you want to learn more about content authenticity for enterprise, or if you want a custom demo, let us know to the right of your screen. We would just love to explore your specific and unique use cases. Okay, let's jump into it. We also had our experts responding directly as well, so hopefully we can get to everything. First up, Ray, what kind of budget do your clients earmark for provenance initiatives? Right with the money.
Great question. Yes. Great question. You got to follow the money, yes. Right? So the existential way to think about that question is that there's a high cost in terms of not investing in provenance. And that tends to be the element that I use to help clients gain socialization and alignment within their organizations. In reality, the actual budget for adding in provenance to a broader production scope is pretty minimal. And, in the before times, we had used the open spec and built it into our production process. And it was fairly lightweight. It was a pass-through cost in a multi-million-dollar production scope. But now, thanks to Cafe and the enterprise solution that you all have put together, we were one of the enterprises asking for a solution like that. It is even easier. So for clients that work with us or clients that have an Adobe scope, it's a pretty easy add-on to their existing production budgets. I think the exact commercial models or the exact amounts are still being worked out, but it's not something that I would lose sleep over or have to get separate approval for from a budget standpoint.
That's great context. Okay, Andy, a question for you. Is there any incubator or accelerator helping new startups in the field by any means? It can include tools, mentorship, community support.
Yeah, thank you for that question. And I'm pleased to give a little more sort of color around what the Content Authenticity Initiative, which Adobe underwrites, does. And it does all of those things. Specifically, we publish open source that is freely licensed. You don't have to pay Adobe or anyone else anything. For those who know how open source works, it's under a very liberal Apache an MIT license, so it's truly free. You can fork that code, you can use it, you can put it in your products with no consequence whatsoever. Open source is great, but you have to know how to use it. So we have a very active developer community on Discord. If you go to opensource.contentauthenticity.org, you'll find all the resources. We also have been releasing, I think, roughly monthly video chapters with one of our community champions who you'll find in Discord. And he has produced a video series about how to put this to work, and it's very practical. It also, warns you about the pitfalls, where things can go wrong. There's also a guide to conformance, which is, just as you would produce a product or, base your startup on a fundamental technology like Wi-Fi, Bluetooth. To ensure interoperability, you basically submit your product to a conformance program, which the CTPA runs. I actually co-chair that group in the CTPA. And that way you can learn about how to do this, make sure it's adjusted properly for your use case. And again, you can buy solutions, or if you're building a company, you're an entrepreneur, grab the open source. Nobody's starting completely from scratch, and this is free. One of the reasons Adobe did this to begin with is to make sure there was this vibrant ecosystem of interoperable products and applications and companies. So we want you to participate. You don't have to buy products from Adobe. We want to build your companies. I'm not sure we want you to compete with us, but the truth is, the more applications, devices, software we have out there, and VC interest in the space, the richer the entire ecosystem is going to be.
Absolutely. Okay, Emily, this came in during your section. They asked if you could give us some examples of responsible use. So maybe some more tangible examples.
Yeah, I always want, what is actionable? What can we actually do?
Yes.
And I think that's such an important piece, because it's easy to talk about it in the abstract. And part of the reason the topics here today were combined is because one of those things you can do that shows responsible use is make sure that you're focused on content provenance and that you're putting those credentials on so that it can be understandable on a workflow level for, say, a marketer or someone who's working inside of a company, really thinking about mapping your process so that you're making conscious decisions about what you automate, whether that's, generating an image and making sure that you're putting appropriate things into the prompt or the system to create that image and checking it when it's out. Now, that checking doesn't necessarily have to be a human. There are some great tools out there to automatically check to make sure it's within your brand guidelines, to make sure it doesn't have bad words or bad images in it. A lot of these systems that we think of as like one AI system are actually 17 or 20 models that have something in there, so it generates and then it checks it itself. And then on an individual level, just be intentional. Think about what part of it is the part you want to be doing. What is the strategy and the human decision that belongs there, so that that use is then intentional and effective. And the number one thing I always tell people is check your outputs before you send them out. We're all tired of getting that thing where somebody put in a prompt and then just sent it to us without looking at it to see if it was actually responsive to what we needed. And when you do that, you can prevent bias issues. You can prevent negative outcomes, because you are trying to own that output and being sure about what's in there. We need to quality control it, just like we quality control anything else.
Yeah, great examples. Okay, Andy, what approach should we take in terms of legality, tracking, and copywriting if we're producing a printed document that uses AI images? Do you have guidance there?
Great question. Of course, content credentials is kind of specifically intended for digital creation. There's not really a way to embed metadata in print material. However, we demoed at Adobe Max a couple of years ago in a sneak, something called, I forget the name of the sneak, blanking on it. But anyway, the idea was you can embed a steganographic watermark, which is invisible, undetectable watermark, in the pixels of an image. And we showed that you can then print that on a mug, just very difficult use cases like a spherical case, a handbag, an irregular surface, hold up your phone, and basically the image itself, or potentially any printed material, becomes its own QR code. And critically, that its own QR code, which is the image itself, you can imagine how useful that could be in an art situation or a print magazine situation, or perhaps a situation like we had with COVID, where you really needed to trust it, the origin of printed material, online material, official communications and all of that. So there is a solution there. I think the question is, what makes most sense for the industry? And I know there's more work actively happening there because we're also involved in liaising with the Twain Association, which are the folks who build software and low-level drivers for scanners and printers. So the capability to embed this information, basically translating a content credential into a steganographic watermark that's undetectable, kind of solves all of those problems. So I'm excited for that ecosystem. I was frankly a little surprised to see the demand from the print industry, or the print media industry, but excited to see it. And like anything else, this is going to take all of us collaborating to make this useful.
Yes, I think that's a great note to end on. Like all of this, we're all learning together and we're navigating together, and it takes all of us to sort of do this together. And so thank you all for sharing so many of your insights. We are right at time. So if we didn't get to the questions, we'll do our best to follow up. I think we did get to most. If you would like us to follow up with a demo, more information, let us know. Also, check out our related resources. You will also get the on-demand recording of this after we wrap. A big, big, big thank you to our audience for being here today, and to our experts, Ray, Andy, Emily, and Emmy. Thank you so much for sharing your insights today.
Thank you.
All right, have a great rest of your day, everyone.